This lesson is going to be about object static methods and some of the commonly used ones, such as assign, where we can merge different strings together, how we can clone a object using the assign, how we can stringify and parse using the JSON method to convert it into a string. So this also allows us to clone the object, how we can use the assign to merge multiple objects together, what freeze does, object freeze. We can check to see if the object is frozen. We can seal the object and check to see if it's sealed. Also, how we can check to see if one object is equal to another object. Create a JavaScript file. I'm calling it JS5 and linking it to my HTML document so that I can open up the HTML file in the browser and have the console output the results from the JavaScript code. So creating an object, we're going to create a couple objects. So create a first object and add some content into that first object. So setting up a property name and then a value that's going to be associated with it. And then we'll select a second object and we're going to add the value of one object into the other. So we're going to have a target object and then a source object where we're going to be combining those values to create a brand new object. So let's go ahead and we'll make some updates to the second object, and then we're going to use the assign value in order to have a returned object. So give this one a name of object3, and then using the object assign method, in the arguments, first we set the object target, and then we're going to select the object source. So the result here is going to be that we're making an update and we're returning back a value for the object3. So it's going to be a new object based on the first two objects. Let's also output those values. And because we use the object1 as the target object, that now has an updated value and it's going to correspond with what we see within object3. So let's also make an update to object3, and we're going to assign a new property value there and assign a value for ID of 3. And we'll see how it reflects within the other objects. So now both of those objects, now they're going to be a shallow copy of object 1 when we're returning it into object 3. So any changes to object 3 are also going to be reflected in object 1. So essentially it's still going to be linking to that same location. It's not actually creating a separate object, as object 3 and object 1 are now going to be linked, because this is just a shallow copy. It's just another variable assigned to that same object. And when we're doing the object assign, that's where we've got the target object. And this same object, object1, so the target object, actually gets returned back, and that's where we're assigning it to object3. So if you want it to clone an object, you can't take an object and give it a new object name, and if we assign it to object3, now all of three of these are going to be attached. So any updates to object 4 are going to be reflected within the other objects. So adding in another value, and then now if we console log out the result for object 1, these are all still going to be connected, and when we output the result, we still get those values. So they're all still pointing to the same memory location, and that's why we're able to make updates to them. So these are not new objects, they're still referencing that same content, and any changes to one will be reflected into the other. You can use the object assign in order to clone to a brand new object. So if we have object 5, and then we use the object assign method, and within the parameters, we're just going to be using a blank anonymous object, so no variable set to it, and then we want to tie it to the object 1, and then we'll make some updates again. We'll add more content to object 1, so add another value, and we can just say hello for this one, and we'll console log out the result that we have for object 5 now, so whatever the current value is for object 5, and we see that that no longer is going to contain the value of hello, and it's not going to be, it's going to be a completely separate object operating independently of the original one. So that's one way that you can do a cloning of the object. There are some alternatives to doing a cloning of objects. So another one that you can use is you can use the JSON stringify and the JSON parse. So what JSON stringify does is this creates a string version. So let's just create some values here, and using the object 1, and we're going to use the JSON stringify method. And this is a JSON method that we can use in order to convert an object into a string, and then that's going to sever the connection to that main object. So this string now is going to be completely a separate variable, and this is going to be a string. When you output it into the console, you can't interact with it, you can't select any of the property names, so this is just a separate string. And what we can do is, if we can convert a string with structured as a object, we can convert it back into an object using parse. So let's go ahead and we'll parse the string and convert it back into an object. And now at this point, when we have our object 6, it's actually going to be a cloned version of the object 1, and we're going to once again be able to interact with the contents. So if we were to take the object 1 and update a value to it, log out the results for object 6 and object 1, we're going to see that they're no longer tied together. So now they're separate, and they've just cloned versions of the object. So also using the assign, we can merge multiple objects together. So let's create a few more objects. We've got object 7 and give it some values within the object 7. So object 7 will have a value of A1. Then object 8 will have a value of B2. And object 9 will have a value of C3. And then object 10 will have a value of A. And let's set the A value to 4. So what do you think the result is? And we're going to use the object 7 as the object that we want to do the object assign to. So let's get the returned results using object assign and setting the target, which is going to be object 7. So that's where we're going to merge the other objects in. And then the values that we want to merge in, so these are all going to be contained within the various objects. And we'll output the result for object 7. And we'll see what we've got now contained within there. So what happened is that this was the original object, but we merged the other objects into it. And when we reassigned a new value to A, when we have a value of 4 for A, it's going to overwrite that initial value of A. So when we're assigning a new object and we're merging them together, if the property names are the same, then those later ones are going to overwrite the previous ones. So this is the same thing that if you had an object and you reassigned a new value to it, it would have that new value. So whatever value is assigned last to the property name is the one that's going to be used. And that's what happens when you merge the objects with the same property values. Let's also try that, and we'll make an update to that where we'll create a new object out of it. And this is going to be a new object since we've got empty object as the target. And that's going to bring in the other object values into the target. And in this case, the target is blank. So we're not assigning it to any existing object. And therefore, it's creating a brand new object. So another object method that you can use, another static method, is an object freeze. So let's say we have our object and we want to freeze it. So let's do an object freeze. And what this will do is this is going to prevent the object from being changed. So if we don't want any changes to take place, we've got the object that we've created. We don't want to make any updates to it. We don't want to reassign any new values to it. Let's see what happens now that we've done the object freeze. We're going to take the object 11, and for the value of A, let's assign a new value to it and see what happens within the console. And we don't see anything within the console. If we do go to strict mode, then this will throw an error in the console if we have strict mode. So we can set the JavaScript code to use strict mode by adding in at the top the command to use strict and save that. So now we're going to get an error thrown if the object property changes. Let's remove out the using of strict. I'll just comment that out. And now, because we're not using the strict mode, we can actually assign a new value without throwing an error, but it's not actually going to take that value within the object. So if we log out the result for object 11A, we're going to see that it's still a value of 4. It hasn't changed. So we haven't updated it because we did the freeze on the object. So this is a way that you can prevent the object from making changes or making changes inadvertently within the code to that object value. You can return back a Boolean value to check to see if an object is frozen. So this way you can check to see and do an object and is frozen. We'll check to see if the object is frozen, and then within the argument you just add in the object. That's going to return back a Boolean value. So in this case it's true. If we check to see if the object is frozen, we'll try another object. And that one should be false because we don't have that object as being frozen. There's also a seal. So the seal method prevents any properties from being added to it. So it's a little bit different than the frozen, but it allows us to not allow any new properties to be added to it. So let's select and we'll do an object seal. So create a new object, or we can use one of the existing objects. We'll use object number 10 for object seal. And using the object seal method, and then within the argument, the object that we want to provide to add the seal to. There's also a way to check to see if the object is sealed. So object and is sealed. We can check to see if the object is sealed, and we did just seal it, so it should come back as true. So there's the true in the console for the sealed object. Now let's try to set a new property for object, and we've got only the one property of a equals 4. So taking object 10 and the value of a, and I'll update that to a string value of test, and then within the console, let's see what we got for the results of object. So now we have a value of a being a value of test, so we can update those properties, but we're not able to delete the object properties. So we've got the value there, and if we were to try to take the object and use the delete method, delete allows us to delete a property from an object. So we would specify delete and then the property of the object. Let's see what happens, and if we are, it's not going to allow us to do that. Got to remove out, and we can see we're throwing an error in strict mode, so that over here on line 48, when we try to delete a property of a, we can't because it's sealed. So in strict mode, just like the freeze, we're going to get the error there. Let's comment out the strict mode and just go back in the regular. So regular doesn't throw any errors, but when we try to check the object, once again after we do the delete, it's simply going to just show up there. So it's not able to delete the actual property name when it is sealed. To check to see if the two objects are of the same value, let's check that where we'll create a brand new object, and this can be object number 12, and we're going to assign the value to it of object 10. And then within the console, we'll do an object is to check to see if the object 10 is equal to object 12. So to see if they're equal. So it comes back as true when they are equal. So it compares the first one to the other one and returns it back as a Boolean. So those are the ones that are equal. So what happens if the object has the same values that's contained within another object? And let's try that. Well, we'll do an object 13 and set the property value of a to be test. We'll see what the result here is. And then we'll console log the 12, we'll do 10 and 13. And that comes back as false. So even though the values contained within both of those are equal, they're not going to be pointing to the same location. So that's still going to come back as false. So this is a way that you can check to see if these are going to be matching, if they're pointing to that same location. So even though the values are the same, where a is equal to a value of test, it's going to come back as false. So these are some of the common methods that you can use when working with objects. And coming up, we'll look at how we can loop through the contents of objects. So that's coming up in the next lesson. So go ahead and try out some of these methods in order to get more familiar with what you can do with objects.